So how this will work, the same as the last panel session, is I will give everyone a couple of minutes just to introduce themselves and how they sort of why they're here as far as this infrastructure investment panel is concerned, and then I'll be asking you questions which may be for all of you or specifically to one or two of you. So Frank, we might start with you at the end, even though we have heard from you today, but your role in this panel and a little bit about Horizon.
So I won't bore everybody by going back over Horizon, but clearly with a local energy company that operate across the state. I personally wear a number of hats related to China, so I'm on the board of a number of organisations that have a particular focus on China. And one of them is the federal government's Australia-China Council. So with the permission of the MC, through the course of the questions that are asked, I'd like to bring a China perspective into what the people in the Pilbara are trying to achieve with Pilbara cities, because I believe China is a source of investment. They're obviously a huge off-taker of commodities and resources, but they have a great appetite, something like $3 to $4 trillion worth of it, of foreign exchange reserves, which are looking for investments outside of Treasury bonds in the US. So I would like to touch on that as we go through.
Thanks, Frank. Eric?
Thank you. I'm Chairman of the West Australian Planning Commission. In my past life, I was Director General of the Department of Planning, and prior to that, Director General of the Department of Planning and Infrastructure, and have long-term involvement in local government, primarily as CEO of City of Swan, where I was charged to not only redevelop the city, but particularly ensure the ongoing development and coordination of strategic initiatives for the City of Midland and through the Metropolitan Redevelopment Authority. So I'm very familiar with coming from I'll call it a low base. I'm very familiar with the needs for ongoing infrastructure, not only the hard infrastructure, but also the social/community infrastructure. Absolutely. And I'm committed as chair to ensure that wherever possible throughout the state and the regional centres that we are planning ready for development rather than trying to do catch up. Yeah. Thank you.
And that's been the message all day. Eric, Gail?
Hi, I'm Gail McGowan. As I say, I've been Director General of the Department of Planning since April, taking over from a very able neighbour next door, and now probably about 80% of our, or 70 or 80% of our work is geared around supporting the WA Planning Commission. Prior to taking on the role with planning, I was involved with Department of State Development, doing a lot of the state initiatives projects, which were very much geared around the resource sector, particularly industrial land, and so hence Ancatel and Ashburton and those sort of estates in particular were very much part and parcel of the work I did on a day-to-day basis. So we're very much about creating the communities and making sure there's adequate land supply.
Thanks, Gail. And just before I go on, can everyone hear at the back? That was a bit... oh, there you go.
Not like that.
Yeah, we heard that. Thank you. Roger.
Thanks. Look, everything in the Pilbara is either imported or exported. I think the population is about 63,000 odd people, according to Dr. Ken King. And the sheer volume of stuff that we actually generate is imported or exported. You're going to need ports and port infrastructure, proper port planning, port corridors, and so on. They are huge economic enablers for the region. So critical to the development of the regional is in fact a critical oversight of the actual ports and the port development. Just to go back and give you some sort of idea of scale, the ports in the Pilbara are now generating close on 40% of the entire world's iron ore seaborne traffic. But think of this, in the Infrastructure Australia reports of 11-12, you'll see that the Port of Melbourne hosted 3,166 foreign vessel calls. Port Hedland alone this year did 5,000. And across the Pilbara ports, which includes all the offshore oil and gas vessel traffic, it's about 12,000 vessel traffic movements across the top of the Pilbara per annum. These are very, very, very big numbers, and of course ports are critical to the long-term growth of the Pilbara.
Thanks, Roger. Nicholas?
Hey, LandCorp was at the forefront when the Pilbara Cities Vision in 2009 was announced, and our role was to look at the ambitions for that and work with other agencies and local government to identify the part of the process to getting to fulfil those ambitions. We undertook The master planning role with other agencies again and with teams of consultants is looking at how did Karratha need to address the planning structure to meet its ambition of 50,000 population and beyond. We also did a lot of work on the master planning of the town centre, coming up with the strategies of how that needed to evolve. We then moved, if you like, to a project management role, implementing some of those ambitions, particularly in the supply of much needed industrial and residential land. We also produced very short marketing videos.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicholas. Well, we'd rather have more land and short videos, wouldn't we? I think. Thank you so much. Look, in our last session, we were talking to representatives in the resource industry and CCIWA, and I'm asking really the same question. So we spoke about, all the work that's been done in the last specifically 5 years to sort of get a bit ahead. And because we've got the five of you here representing the main players in infrastructure, do you feel like for the Pilbara and Karratha that we are on the front foot and that we're ready for the next stage? I'd just be really keen, and maybe I'll start with you, Nicholas. Do we feel like in that region we're getting ahead? I know LandCorp is a big part of that, and there was always the discussion about land availability and land releases, and I know there's so much work's been done on that. So do you feel like we're now, on the front foot as far as infrastructure planning goes?
Certainly in the case of in economic and employment land, I mean, we would certainly point to the success of Gap Ridge, which is a 240 hectare estate with currently about 40 people occupying it, major people like Chevron, Toll, Coke, and ultimately, we think it's probably got at least a 5 to 10 year supply there, but ultimately it will employ about 1,600 people, and I think it's very well positioned in a fabulous facility for the city. I think the other area is obviously the people aspect, and we would point to the Warambie Service Village, Workers Village, which has provided opportunities for small business to become more viable within the city, whereby discounted rental accommodation, we can accommodate a lot of people to support those vitally important services. So I think, and there's a waiting list for that still, still strong demand for that. But I think generally in those two areas, I think we've made great inroads, but there's always more to be done.
Absolutely. And Nicholas, we talked in the earlier panel about the small business sector and trying to encourage more small businesses to either open up or start, or people to move to Karratha and the Pilbara for the small businesses and things like that. There has to be those incentives, or just making it a bit easier for them, I think. I'd agree. Roger?
Look, I think in terms of planning, port planning is well advanced and our thinking is well developed. But in terms of infrastructure, we're way behind the 8 ball. I'll give you a bunch of typical examples. So, for example, junior miners in the Pilbara, there's no capacity to manage them. All the capacity is chewed up, and yet people are still crying poor and needing more facilities, and we don't have. I was on the De Grey station 2 weeks ago talking to the Battinis who own the station. They've got 10,000 head of cattle ready to export. I don't have facilities for that in Port Edwin. I mean, we'll manage, but they're trucking all the way down to Fremantle, and I'm saying that's just crazy. The development of things like Lumsden would absolutely, allow us to provide the capacity. So I don't believe we have the physical capability ready to go for the next wave of economic development in the region.
Okay, interesting. Gail, on this question of, are we on the front foot, you and Eric together, or you first and then?
Look, I think we'll probably do a tag team in
Yep,
very much. I think there's a number of aspects. I think, the dilemma of infrastructure provision when it comes, the juxtaposition between build it and they will come and demand driven, and whether government pays, whether industry pays is always going to be a bit of a dilemma. On the urban land side, I think we've been working pretty hard to make sure there is land available for urban expansion. And I think we've had a steady flow of lots and dwellings in that land supply pipeline, and I think at the end of June we had a stock of about 584 residential lots, and I think up to June 2014 for the past 2 years, or 2 years prior to that, we had about an average of 77 lots per quarter created.
Wow.
And we've got about 1,000 hectares of undeveloped land that's appropriately zoned. So in a sense, that's in place. The industrial land's pretty well in place, as Nicholas said. The whole infrastructure provision, and I'll segue to Eric on that because of the Pilbara infrastructure and planning framework.
I'd just like to make 2 points, as Gail's touched on. We have developed a planning and infrastructure framework with the assistance of the Royal Eastern Regions during the Honourable Brendan Grill's term as Minister. That sets a very sound framework. I think one of the other issues is to keep reviewing them, whether they are appropriate and timely. And I'd like to pick up Roger's point, which is an issue that's been impacting on my mind recently from 2 perspectives. Firstly, coming to talk to you today, the issue relating to development of Karratha as a proper city centre is critical, particularly from small business. But we can't lose the focus that, like the development of Perth in the early part of the century, if we didn't have a very strong port facility like Fremantle and the connectivity and the integration of those aspects of Fremantle Port from freight, other export, import perspectives is important. And I think because of the rapid development of Pilbara, and particularly as has been mentioned, whilst the boom may have subsided, we are still very confident in growing. And as Roger's pointed out, we need to be in front, not only in planning for cities, but also in planning for other facilities such as port and the relevant logistics behind that, where it's transport, infrastructure, adequate land. And I mean, reason that comes to mind is because we don't want to get caught to the degree that Perth may get caught in terms of the outer harbour. Fremantle has a capacity, no question about that. It's been a very strong economic drive for the Perth region and to a degree the Southwest region, but the Pilbara ports are critical to have those planning ready, which includes infrastructure, to ensure those ongoing economic benefits which can be facilitated through port can cascade through. That will also then reinforce the ability of the City of Karratha to develop, and particularly from a small business point of view. You've got to understand the various elements that have to come together so that you can really develop an integrated city rather than just a very narrow-based city.
Exactly, and I think we heard this morning from Chris Adams about, 5 or 6 years ago, that there was just they couldn't build one more house as far as power, and all sorts of different types of essential service infrastructure. Whereas now, if there's a project that comes on 1,000 people and need it in, they're ready to go. It's not all completely there, but so much further ahead. And I think, Eric, it is a lot about that. I think.
Yeah, and I think what I'm saying, we need to be planning ready.
Yeah, planning ready.
And when it's planning ready, we need to then be ready to put in place, with input from private as well as the government sector,
absolutely,
to make sure things happen in a timely way.
Yep.
Otherwise, and this is no pun, you might miss the boat.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Frank, so we're on the front foot. You're feeling, you're expertly placed to talk about this as one of those essential service providers.
Yeah. Look, I think the Pilbara City's vision was bold, which was fantastic, and I think it's provided real focus. And that focus will be tested, I think, as we go through the commodity cycle. And sustaining a vision, the framework, the planning that's gone into the framework that Eric mentioned, I think is really, really quite fundamental. But sustaining that vision through what is going to be a more difficult period for the region, I think long term, medium term, the region's got lots of upside. It's got lots of resources, I think, as Bernard suggested, that are going to be wanting by the rest of the region. But going through this next phase is going to be really quite critical and important. And I think then promoting the vision and being even bolder in the way that the vision is being told to countries that we are supplying resources to. So, I think China's history is one of where they developed special development zones, where they originally put those together for the purpose of inviting investment, so they could learn, they could bring in knowledge, they could actually fast-track their development. And in a sense, the vision of Pilbara Cities is something like that. But actually taking it to that next step and actually making it a regional initiative where I think there's a real appetite for countries like China and that to start to invest from being simply an off-taker to investing in projects, to investing in infrastructure that supports project. That's going to be really fundamental. But the key is to sustain a plan, to promote a plan, and to actually demonstrate a vision, which is what they would become much more comfortable with. So I think we've started, but there's a long way to go. But I think everything is, pretty green in terms of the future.
Exactly, but I think, Frank, long-term collaborative planning and vision, that's the key to any sort of success. And I feel like I've said that 25 times already, but that really is the key to any sort of success in planning anything. I will stay on you, Frank, and this is a question for everyone, but we'll come back down the panel. So this is a bit of a sort of wish list question. So if you had, just from your perspective and from in your role, if you could give me your sort of top 3 priorities for Horizon Power for the Pilbara, as far as infrastructure and the difference they would make. Now, I know you've probably got 50 on your list, or Roger was saying, can I only do 3? It's like, yes, you can only do 3. You don't get a chocolate if you do more than 3. But just your top 3 priorities on your wish list as far as infrastructure from Horizon Power's point of view.
So let me just focus on energy. I think energy and the development of the energy infrastructure in the Pilbara, I think, is at a turning point. It's gotten so big that we need to bring some coordination and planning to it. If I look at some of the glaring examples that exist, we've got transmission lines running over one another that are of different voltages, not connected. Companies pay the consequence of having to then support edge of grid type issues, where they wouldn't have been an issue had they been connected to the line that runs underneath them. We've got Citic Pacific that are sitting 80 kilometres from Karratha. They've built a 500 megawatt power station. They have obligations on take or pay for gas. They're not connected to the system. Their plant is still, going through the motions of startup, and they've been in that position for 2 to 3 years. They would have made quite some money, and I think they would have paid for the investment in actually connecting to Karratha had they had that connection between the power station and Karratha. I think the interconnector between Karratha and Port Hedland was put in the 1980s under SEQA, hasn't been upgraded since. Demand in both of the centres, Karratha and Port Hedland, has increased. We need to take a look at that, and that certainly, if it was invested in, would be something that would be for the public good, for the general business good, and would lend itself to thinking about how we might develop that in a PPP fashion. And then I think the East Pilbara link, which is something that we've we've promoted and others have promoted, which would connect effectively Hedland to Newman and pick up stranded generation capacity that exists in Newman, would be a logical next step in actually creating a ring main of high voltage transmission that runs along the coast, goes into inland and picks up all the mines, and then would give security of supply and give the real fabric of the beginning of an energy market that we could start to evolve. Yep. So I think around energy, there's any number of major investments that stand out.
Exactly, and then just is vital. Eric, top 3?
Well, I'd like to focus on 2.
Okay, you get 2 chocolates.
But I'd just reinforce what Frank said. When we were developing the infrastructure planning framework, I was just amazed about the disconnects in terms of energy. And to have a sustainable energy supply for the Pilbara, it's critical for that integrated coordination of energy networks is to be facilitated. The second point, which builds onto that, is apart from promoting multi-user facilities, which have been touched on in terms of port and rail networks, is to ensure that we have appropriate infrastructure corridors planned and protected for the future. This is an issue which we're trying to approach in an integrated way in terms of Perth and Peel regional planning we're doing now. But again, it is a critical issue for the development of the Pilbara to ensure they are in place, not only for the short term, but also for the longer term. And then I'll hand over to Gail to do any 3 she likes.
Well, I think coming from a state development background, I always used to say with some of the infrastructure issues, development in this state would be easy if we could get people to play nicely in the same sandpit.
Yes.
So I think the extent to which we can get those economies of scale and synergies is right. I think the couple of exciting things, like at least the start of the Pilbara Power Project has been a really good initiative, and Horizon have done some great work in that space. I certainly think the ongoing reliable water supply, particularly around Karratha with the floodplain issues, etc., is always going to be challenging, and having something that's not climate dependent. And I suppose a bit of a passion for seeing Anchortel develop, because that gives another opportunity, particularly to some of the juniors as well. Yeah.
Thanks,
Roger?
Glad you mentioned Anchortel. I don't have to.
Nice segue.
So I'll go back and cut it 3 different ways. So in the West Pilbara, right now as we speak, we've started land development backing at the Port of Ashburton North, so Port Authority land being built. That's pretty critical for the development of that area, and in order to make sure that the port is ready in time in about 18 months for handover to Port Authority. So that's a priority project. The second project, I'll go back through to Dampier. Just understand this. Shipping channels are critical pieces of infrastructure. They are the enablers that allow those big vessels to get out, get the productivity, etc., etc. And in the Port of Dampier, we have just started now a full 200% Class A hydrographic survey process, which will take us down a journey over the next 18 months or so on to optimising the capability of those channels and reducing unit costs, because what worries me is to make sure that our seaborne traffic on a unit-for-unit basis is better than that coming out of Brazil or anywhere else. I think that's critical to understand. The competition isn't between the ports in the Pilbara, it's between Australian ports and other offshore ports. And the third piece of critical infrastructure that isn't funded as yet, isn't fully funded, and that we really need to build as a matter of urgency is Lumsden in Port Hedland. It's a big piece of general cargo infrastructure and will take a lot of pressure off roads. It has huge economic benefits according to the surveys that we've actually done. So those are my 3.
Thank you. Nicholas?
I think from a hard infrastructure point of view, I think the important ones have been covered, and certainly Anchortel and the electrical thing. Perhaps just shifting to softer infrastructure and town-based, going to the issue of the amenity objective of Pilbara cities. I think there's a cultural infrastructure issue. The city has the vision of the theatre and entertainment centre at the end of Sharp Avenue. You would think those sorts of things would be fundamental to that issue of population growth and amenities. So I would see that as an important piece of infrastructure. Not particularly a LandCorp project, but it's certainly something we would strongly support. I think the other one is good quality tourism infrastructure, both in terms of the short stay accommodation, and I think for that to be really successful and to take off in Karratha further, the TWA FIFO sort of issue needs to move to the next stage of resolution. But I think that would be excellent. And perhaps the third one, again, it's not a LandCorp objective, but certainly was a vision, part of the Pilbara City's vision, is that concept of tertiary education in Karratha. How would that, again, at the soft infrastructure level, contribute to the diversity and the amenity of the community?
Yeah. And I think, Nicholas, when you're talking about tourism, that's been mentioned, there's been a lot of conversation today about diversification, and we understand that for the whole state, but tourism has been brought up quite a few times, because I think as a region, we all know how much there is on offer from a tourism point of view from the Pilbara, but maybe it hasn't been developed as much as other regions. Would that be fair to say? I think someone going to throw something at me for saying that, but I think there is a lot of work to be done on that area, and it's also the mindset of it is getting people ready for that tourism growth, not necessarily even the actual physical infrastructure. Would you think that? I mean, around the table there has been a lot of conversation today about tourism.
I think perhaps relates to one of the later questions, the need of the marketing and the telling the story of Karratha, and the opportunities has probably been very much over the last few years around the resources issue, the ports, the importance of infrastructure, all the hard stuff. But in actual fact, Karratha is growing into and has a fabulously diverse base.
Yes.
But it's been that diversity has not been its priority, and it probably needs to come to the fore. Therefore, the big problem from a tourist point of view, as it is with so many aspects of Karratha, is the distance issue. Everything costs so much per square or per kilometre.
Is that right?
I agree with that.
And that is a Western Australian issue. It's spectacular. It's the most spectacular state, but the cost of getting anywhere sometimes, you know, you have to go a long way to see something really spectacular, and it's about that as well, but that can be overcome. I think another question for all of you is, we know that more than 1.2 billion has been spent in the region, in particular the Pilbara City's vision as part of that. So someone mentioned to me, is it a case of build it and they will come? Or what's the next step now for achieving 50,000 by 2035, which is the aim? So Frank, I will start with you. So I know we've talked about some of the wish list things. What's the next step for taking that forward?
So if I take the opportunity to just talk about the link to China, I
Yes.
think the federal government, this is probably back under Julia Gillard, signed up to an MOU with the Chinese government, and that was meant to facilitate infrastructure investment. To the best of my knowledge, apart from normal commercial transactions, nothing has been done under that umbrella MOU. I know that the state government, to its full credit, also signed an MOU for infrastructure investment with the National Development Reform Commission, the NDRC, in China. And to the best of my knowledge, I suspect the Midwest was a focus of that, but nothing has yet come from that apart from normal commercial transactions. We're about to sign, I suspect, a free trade agreement with China, which is probably going to provide another umbrella to actually facilitate infrastructure investment. So I think the opportunity is there for the Pilbara specifically because of its importance to us, its importance to China, to actually start to promote this as a place where China can invest, and they can go further downstream and they can invest in that supporting infrastructure, the energy infrastructure we spoke about. They can start to support community engagement. I think, you know, it is really about taking where we've started and actually starting to promote it. If I think about the enormous challenge, 1.2 billion is probably a drop in the ocean in terms of our vision and where we need to get to. The state government has really got its own budget pressures. Corporates are going to be doing the best they can, but they're going to be fighting to deal with productivity, a much more competitive environment globally. So, you know, we really need to think innovatively about how we keep the momentum and how we, you know, we don't have to shoulder the burden all of ourselves. We can actually start to promote. I think the Pilbara is something that's like Hong Kong, that's like Singapore, that's like, you know, the Shanghai Free Trade Zone that is being developed by the Chinese. So why not make it that? You know, it's sitting there, and in 20, 30, 40 years, as Bernard was saying earlier on, you know, I'd like to think that we're well beyond 100,000 people. We've populated that, so it is a major city, and it is actually providing security, which is another issue that should come to the fore in due course. Much better to have that part of the world populated and engaged rather than as it is now. So, you know, I think there's a long, long way to go, but I think actually taking the vision and promoting it internationally is the next big step for us.
Exactly, international investment. And I think the other thing, Frank, is talking about a lot of people over the breaks that I've been listening to and having conversations with has been, you know, the reason that the City's Vision project worked is there was that planning with everyone involved, but it's also really, it needs to be long-term infrastructure planning that's worked on and looked at and reviewed and changed. Like you do in your own corporation, you all have strategic planning days. You might do it every 2 years. You go, all right, where are we going? Have we done this? You know, we really need that for the state. That's long term. That's constantly looked at and altered, but that, you know, we don't get back into those old habits of playing catch up. And, you know, in the ideal world, it should be a bipartisan thing. But, you know, really we need to put those planning sort of, if everyone's on the same song sheet, if you like, and everyone has that point of view that we all need to plan ahead. I mean, that is a bit ideal, but really that's the way forward. Eric?
I think one of the major issues is, apart from being planning ready and having appropriate strategies, is having a degree of flexibility within those strategies to react to changing. And that's why I believe those strategies need to be reviewed every 5 years or thereabouts and updated, not only from a infrastructure maximisation point of view, but also ensuring that you still have the opportunities for investment. I think the other issue which is important in like any towns or cities that have been based on a single focus is that if you want to it won't necessarily happen if you just build it and they come.
No.
They've got to come for a reason, and this really gets into what I call the social and community experience, which has been touched on. Now, that aspect is very important in terms of ensuring that the employment base is there, but it's a diversified employment base. Sorry? It's okay, good.
Yeah.
You're going to get removed a diversified employment base, because that then gives that social and community cohesion. And whether it's diversification involving tourism and other aspects, one thing to remember, as your employment grows, so does your service employment demand grows, servicing the town.
Yep.
And that gives you the stronger diversification and the strength to be more resilient to changes in the economy. And Pilbara, like WA, is all subject to key economic drivers, not only within the state and Australia, but also overseas. And that's where we've got to build those sustainable towns, so that if things do flatten out, you have other areas. And I think that's a lesson we learnt from towns that have been focused on tourism. If they're purely focused on tourism as one element and haven't got the diversification, then they suffer if
Exactly.
it goes down. And so I think that's the key message I'd give
Yeah, and I
for
think
building forward in the future.
exactly. And
Keep building the communities.
Yes, and I think that sense of community and that sense of belonging, you know, we talk about Karratha now being, you know, people are choosing to live there, not just work there. And I'm from Kalgoorlie, and Kalgoorlie's a city that there's a lot of people, a third of the population turns over every 11 years, but you talk to a lot of people there that go to Kalgoorlie for 2 years, and 15 years later they're there because they get involved and embedded, and that's the thing. It's not about, I mean, they may go there for work, but it's actually about that sense of place and the community and the, you know, you might call them the soft things, but maybe the intangible things, the sense of community. And I think, you know, there was a conversation this morning, there's those community-based organisations like sporting clubs have a huge role in that, because that's such a tie. It really shouldn't be underestimated.
And that's very important, because sporting clubs depend a lot on volunteers.
Exactly.
I've had experience of those.
Yeah. I think most people would.
And if you cannot get the people to help make those sporting facilities tick,
Yep.
albeit supported by state government, but particularly the local government, but
Yep.
having the volunteers, then they cannot operate, and that's another factor where the community loses cohesion and attractiveness.
Exactly. So Gail, you okay? Yep.
Oh yes, well, I've finished choking now, so that's fine.
Yeah.
I'm going to depart from script entirely.
That's
here,
okay.
because in picking up on a couple of those points. One of the things I was involved in a volunteer capacity a few years ago was something the Graduate School of Education at UWA was doing with students studying a unit called Rural Education, and they used to do what they called a rural education field trip, where they'd go up into the Gascoyne and Murchison over the course of a week, billet prospective teachers with teachers already working in the area.
Fantastic.
You know, and interact to actually get the young prospective teachers familiar with the idea that country teaching might not be a bad thing, or living in the bushes might not be a bad thing. And that then encouraged them to do their teaching prac in the regions and potentially teach in the regions. And it's those sorts of experiential things that I think are quite critical in that space. But
Exactly.
then I'm going to go completely the other way and just give Frank some reassurance on the MOU with the National Development and Reform Commission. It was signed between the state government and the Chinese government, very much about getting better understanding of the way business has been done. And there actually have been quite a number of exchanges, contingent exchanges, because there was a real sense from Chinese companies, particularly state-owned enterprises, that to do business here, they actually had to be introduced to government by a particular company, and they got burnt off them. And some of the experiences, you know, I don't need to go into the detail here, but there have been quite a lot of exchanges, including one this year, where I think Paul Vogel and Steve Wood and others went to China and ran workshops on some of the, you know, our environmental laws, etc. And so that free exchange. So I think certainly it's not necessarily, it wasn't about them buying into infrastructure so much, but a cooperation agreement. So it's proceeding relatively slowly, but I think it's a really important building block in terms of that relationship. So I think there's good prospectivity there.
Right, thanks Gail.
And just building on both of those themes, I do believe Eric's hit the nail on the head in terms of diversification. You've got to diversify the base. And I just want to give you some of our thinking in that space, but just think about applying it more broadly across agencies and industries. So across the top of the Pilbara, we have the biggest number of marine pilots in the country. I think there's 26 now in Port Hedland, and Rio's got 13 or 14 in Dampier, and Woodside's got a couple in Dampier, and of course there's going to be some now across at Onslow and so on. And up until a couple of years ago, we were flying these pilots. They cost us about $500,000 or $600,000 a year, so work it out on a daily rate, flying them all the way to Queensland and putting them up for 2 or 3 days worth of simulator training every year. And so we went back sort of saying, well, let's reverse that. We've got the biggest number of pilots. Why wouldn't we have a simulator and a training facility in the Pilbara? Why isn't there a maritime college in the Pilbara with all the expertise right at your doorstep where you can actually have on-the-job training? So we looked to put a simulator in Port Hedland. We didn't have a facility big enough or with sufficient power supply. So we've gone and commissioned here in Fremantle in March this year the world's leading edge simulator. It has 4 tug bridges, 2 ship bridges and a VTS. So we can actually fully mirror exactly what happens in this case in Port Hedland. And of course I've spoken to people like Rio and the rest and saying, save yourself pilot days away because they're very expensive. At least bring it home to Western Australia. But at some stage, when we have the building facility, we're going to pick it up and move it into the Pilbara. And when you start to have leading edge facilities, maritime type facilities in the Pilbara, you can attract people from all over the country and indeed all over the world. We get Dutch rotor tug pilots coming out here to come and see, well, how do you blokes do it? So, you completely reverse the equation where they're coming to us for leading edge training and technology, and that gives us another whole school of training. And it's not only reliant on traffic in the Pilbara. If traffic goes up and down in cycles, it also provides an ongoing school of training for offshore as well as elsewhere in the country. So that's just typically one of the things that you can talk about in terms of diversification.
Thank you, Nicholas.
That certainly picks up on the tertiary education aspect as well, which you point out is great. I think one of the big things, the 1.2 billion you've mentioned, Kitty, the leverage of that spend by government to get the private sector involved. And Gail talked about getting young teachers up there and telling them about that. That's part of promotion of Karratha and the Pilbara, and I still think there's huge opportunity to promote the opportunities into the private sector. We've had some great support from the likes of Finbar and Cedarwood, Jackson and Pindan and others, but from a property development point of view. But I think that story is still a good one to be told, and we're doing work certainly with the PDC and with the Shires and a bit of a joint marketing initiative to promote much of the Pilbara, because I think there's so much investment going in there, and we're certainly in times of relatively constrained investment ability at a government level, but there's been so much investment gone in, there's a lot to be talked about and still to be leveraged, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, amazingly, we're actually nearly at the end of we are at the end of our session. So I just wanted to thank all 5 of you for coming along today, but also sharing your expertise. I think it's really important that we hear from all the different players and just people that have got an influence or are involved in the Pilbara region. So can you please thank our panellists for this afternoon? Thank you very much.